Welcome to my presentation. I want to speak about human rights. Why countries differ in human rights. Why are there so huge gaps in human rights between different countries? Human rights are very important for the well-being of people. And why in some countries they are more respected than in others? Why in some countries they are less respected than in others? What can be the causes for this? For answering this question, I will choose a cross-country comparison approach. I will not analyze the historical development. I will mention historical development, but the core method of my approach is a comparison of countries today, and I will relate differences in human rights between countries to differences in other probably important variables like rule of law or culture or cognitive ability or education. And in the end, I want to answer the question why science is not so interested in answering this question. And I will show that this is related to the possible causes for differences between countries in human rights. So let's start now with the presentation. So hello again, and now here with the presentation. The presentation is based on a paper that I published 2018 with Noah Kao. Noah Kao is a sociologist, and the photo here was taken around this time when the paper was written early before or 1 year before 2018. Let's start speaking about the submission history. We submitted the paper, the manuscript, to 6 different journals. This is not so exceptional that the paper is rejected, but what is somewhat strange is what we received as a reply or as a review. We first submitted to psychological review and it was immediately rejected because they said it's a mismatch, and I think that is okay because they usually publish large review studies based on several single studies of the authors or other authors, and our paper was a single study paper. Then we submitted it to Psychological Bulletin, and it was after 3 months rejected because, as they said, the text would be crude and inflammatory, and another quote, the Ku Klux Klan was a Christian terrorist organization. I don't know what the Ku Klux Klan has to do with human rights and our paper, but this was the major content of the review. So we learned nothing of in these 3 months in this review process to improve our paper. Then the third journal paper, Brain Sciences, made also an immediate desktop rejection because it would represent a mismatch, but the reply was very friendly. Then we sent it to the American Sociological Review, also a very well-known journal in this field, and received an immediate desktop rejection within a few hours because, as they said, our paper would ignore contemporary sociological research, and the paper would not stand up in terms of methodological rigor that our readers expect. I emailed them back and asked what sociological research, what literature we have not read and have not cited and have not considered in writing our paper, and there was no answer. And I also asked what we can do to improve our method, or where are the faults in our methodological approach, and there was no answer. And I emailed 2 times, and 2 times I received no answer. So it seems that this kind of feedback was not based on a real reading of our paper, and that the points raised were not standing for real critical points, real weaknesses of our paper that we can improve, but that there were other reasons why they did not like our paper. Then we sent it to the American Journal of Sociology, and they said the paper would not be written for their typical sociology readership. Finally, we sent it to comparative sociology, and there we had a standard review process with different reviews, and we improved our paper, and finally it was published. We think that this paper deals with a very important research subject with human rights. Human rights are essential for the quality of life, for the well-being of people, are essentially for the working, functioning of political institutions. And so we thought that this paper will be well received and frequently cited in science, and also well received by a wider public group, or by a wider public audience. But since 5 years since this paper was published, we received only 8 sites, and from these 8 sites, 5 were by at least one of the authors, either by me or by Noah Kaul. So we have only 3 sites by other scientists, and only one of these 3 sites is in the broader field of human rights research. But here, the site was only one part of a longer list on human rights research. Looking this first analysis was based on the database of Scopus. Scopus lists scientific publications and counts sites and analyzes them. The same can be done with Hartzing based on Google Scholar, and they are usually more, or this program usually finds more sites. We have here 10 sites, but here 6 again, the majority by at least one of the authors, and only 2 were from the broader field of human rights research. And one of these 2 was a dissertation, and usually dissertations are not read by other scientists. So there is again an indicator for a very low reception. Then looking at the broader audience, using Google, there was one tweet about our paper. It was mentioned in one news page, and in one book there was a reference. Taken together, the scientific reception is almost 0, or essentially 0, and the public reception is also almost 0. And this, in spite of we were dealing with a very important subject, human rights, and this is traditional also not a or more a left-wing progressive subject, and so this is astonishing that this was not more frequently read and cited. And in the end of this presentation, I will come back to this question, and I will try to answer why this paper was not so well received, not picked up by a broader audience. What are human rights? What we understand by the term human rights. Human rights comprise civil and political freedom and participation rights. in detail the right to life, the prohibition of torture, the freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, and the equality before the law. And these rights, or the combination of different single human rights, or human rights in total, are granted for all people. As they have a universal scope. All people are equal in rights. Also, we have universality, equality. All people are equal in rights, including women, children, and people of other religions, nations, and races. There is no exclusion. Human rights are also valid for criminals, for example. Substantively, there are negative rights such as freedom from torture or freedom from slavery, and there are positive rights such as freedom of speech, the right to a fair trial, including criminals and people we do not like. A very famous step in the historical process of human rights was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations in 1948. How human rights developed in history. There are three major developments. First of all, more and more people are included in the circle of beneficiaries. That means across time, across the centuries, human rights apply to more and more different people. Second, the rights are becoming more codified, more institutionalized. They are written down, and courts and police, for example, have to respect the human rights. And the rights become broader. Not only the protection from unjustified persecution is included, but also, for example, the right to free speech. Major historical steps were the Magna Carta in England, 1215, the new laws, Leyes Nuevas, in Spain and Latin America, 1542, the Habeas Corpus Act, 1679 England, the Bill of Rights, 10 years later, the Virginia Declaration of Rights in the United States, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen in France, and the before-mentioned Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations in 1948. There's also a trend not mentioned by me before, that the nationally struggle of some people has led across time to more rights for other people who are in the beginning not included in the circle of beneficiaries. Initially, there was a fight between the less powerful in the second row against the more powerful in the first row. Also a fight of the nobleman against the king to have more rights. It's more or less a power fight and less a human rights fight. We want more power. We want to be respected. We want to have our own property, our own rights, and we want to be more independent from the king. And this power fight has led across centuries to rights for people who are not included in this, who were not included in this power struggle. More and more citizens, and then all people, all men and women are included among the concept of human rights. There's a big exception in this trend, and this was 1542, the new laws, Leyes Nuevas, and there was explicitly intended to protect other people, not the powerful people, but people A protected people C against the mistreatment of people B. A protected C against the mistreatment of B. And this is really a new aspect in the historical development of human rights. And today, this is the present state that the less powerful people are also protected by the human rights, and the intellectual aim is to protect especially these people. What was decided by the new laws, Leyes Nuevas? The Spanish king wanted that the Native Americans, the American Indians in Latin America, South America, Middle America, are better treated, are more protected. And this was advocated by the Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas. And here's also an important aspect that the Christian religion, the Christian worldview, the Christian ideology played a role in the development of human rights, and especially in this aspect that people without power are protected. I want to present now two major theories on the development and practice of human rights, and two additional theories which could be also important or could be important alternatives. I want to speak here about the development of human rights, in particular about human rights per se, not about the power struggle between second and first tier powerful people. The first important theory is the cognitive moral enlightenment theory. The major idea is that correct thinking will lead to correct behavior, or incorrect thinking will lead to incorrect, not ethically guided behavior. This theory was developed in classical philosophy, in cognitive psychology, and sociology. Important representatives were the philosophers Plato and Aristotle, the psychologists Jean Piaget and Lawrence Kohlberg, or the sociologists Jürgen Habermas and Georg Österdikow. Here on the right, I have a photo here of Georg Österdikow, a German scholar. A quote which illustrates the idea is here from Jean Piaget, the French-Swiss psychologist, developmental psychologist. A parallelism exists between moral and intellectual development. Logic is the morality of thought, just as morality is the logic of action. The parallelism is based on the cognitive structure, cognitive nature of morality, e.g., to behave ethically, one has to take the perspective of third parties. Correct thinking will lead to correct behavior. The alternative theory model, the alternative paradigm is culture, the impact of culture, of worldviews and religion. When we speak about culture, we do not speak about habits of eating or of clothes. When we get up in the morning and when we go down to sleep, but about fundamental views of the world. And the most important worldview is religion. This model is based on the sociologist Max Weber and Werner Sombart, and on the political scientist and activist Lawrence Harrison from the United States. How can religion may have an effect on human rights? Religion changes beliefs and social organization and human behavior in everyday life via its original message, Bible, Quran, for example, the role model function of its founder, the later interpretations of its original message, which may change across centuries, and its lived practice, what are doing people who are believers of a special religion. Let's go more in detail here, for example, for Christianity. What is telling the original message, what can be seen as relevant for human rights? In Judaism and Christianity, it is said that God created man in his own image. So people are like copies from God. Humans being the image of God, God-likeness, implies treating humans in a respectful way. And this applies to all humans or not to a special group among humans. A high value is attributed to an individual human being. But the Old Testament also contains much advocacy of violence, of killing of enemies, and so on. So the original message is not only from today's point of view a human one. Second, the role model function of its founder. Here for Christianity, it's Jesus. Jesus himself never used violence, but spoke out against violence, and he himself suffered violence. He stands for helping the weak, the sick, and the outcast. But there are also some threats of the last judgment. What later interpretations of the original message tell about human rights? For example, the before mentioned Dominican priest Bartolomé de las Casas, he fighted for the protection of Indians, of other people, not of his class against the king, but of he fighted for the rights for the human treatment of other people. And what is telling the lived praxis about possible relevance of Christianity for human rights? Let's look at the evangelical Christian William Wilberforce. He was a fighter for the rights of Africans, of other people. He fought for the end of slavery. Or the evangelical and Christian Henry Dunant. He is the founder of the Red Cross to protect the wounded. Or the Protestant theologian Albert Schweitzer. He's the founder of a hospital in Gabon to help Africans. All these people were fighting for the rights, for the better treatment of other people. But, however, we know many Christians did not behave in a Christian way, but the original Christian message nevertheless had a corrective function, and these examples on this page are important
indicators for this. Let's have a look at the other international important religion, Islam. What is telling the original message, the Quran, about human rights? What is important for human rights here? In many places, there is prescribed a harsh treatment of people of other faith, Jews or Christian, or of people not having or not belonging to these three major religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. There is an ethical dualism. People of other religions are treated in a worse way. And there are also many places where the treatment of women is less favorably. Women seem to have less rights, fewer rights than men. Let's look at the role model function of its founder. Muhammad is both. He was a religious founder and he was a political and military leader. And for Michael Hart, Muhammad is the most influential person in human history. I will quote Michael Hart. It is this unparalleled combination of secular and religious influence which I feel entitles Muhammad to be considered the most influential single figure in human history. But being a political and military leader comes with some costs. Muhammad took part in wars, in executions, in cruel punishments, for example, of Jews, and in enslavement. The later interpretations of its original message contains also some important information about human rights. For example, the Persian theologian and polymath Al-Ghazali, he wrote also in a negative way about the treatment of women. And the lived practice today, or the last decades, this last 2 centuries, sheds also light on the way how human rights are seen. For example, in Saudi Arabia, there is the position that the concept of human rights, the Western concept of human rights, violates the sacred law of Islam Sharia. And based on this view, in 1990, Muslim countries signed their own Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam, whose content differs from that of the UN Declaration from 1948. For example, the Article 19 of the Cairo Declaration prescribes the application of the Sharia for the punishment of criminals, and the Sharia includes mutilations as punishment. Muslims who are more religious tend to be more violent, whilst more religious Christians tend to be less violent. So this deals not only with people belonging to a special religion, but people who are belonging to a special religion who are more religious, they behave depending on their religion, more violent or less violent. This study was done in Germany by a criminological research group. Also, the attitude towards others and towards the treatment of others, meaning people who are different from oneself, this treatment or these ideas are also different between the religions, between believers of different religions. 54% of Muslims, but only 11% of Christians agreed with the statement that they don't want homosexual friends. Crime rates of immigrants and Muslim background of country are positively related in European countries. That means that immigrants who are coming from a predominantly Muslim country show higher crime rates than immigrants who are coming from countries who have a major Christian or a less Muslim background. This study was done at the level of countries, and it could be indirectly inferred to individuals, and we have also evidence from the individual level, like in the 2 points above, that religion has an impact of the individual behavior of person. But, and this is an important objection, is this maybe only a question of time, or in future disappearing lack of modernization, and we need only to wait some decades and people of different religions will be very similar in their attitudes and behavior. We have dealt with two major theoretical paradigms, the cognitive paradigm and the cultural paradigm, and now we're coming to institutions and political historical processes. The idea is here that the political system, parliaments, democracy, rule of law, courts, police, and so on, the concrete, the abstract political system, the abstract law, and the concrete persons working in institutions like in courts and police have an impact on human rights, a positive or negative impact on human rights. And we will see there's a high correlation between political aspects of societies and human rights. But the question is whether the political system, the institutions, also not depend on cognitive development or on cultural determinants. There's a study supporting the effect of pure institutional effect independent from culture. It seems to be that institutions introduced by British and French colonists during colonialism seem to have had a positive impact on the formerly colonized countries today. So the past institutions introduced by British and French colonies today have a positive effect on political institutions in those countries, and this relative or compared to institutions introduced by the Spanish or Portuguese. And this could be, or these institutions or this institutional effect could have also a positive effect until today on human rights. Further factors, evolution and consanguinity. There are studies showing that Roman and medieval law enforcement had a genetically positive impact on pacification and behavioral self-control of the people. By removing those people who have not shown appropriate behaviors, in detail, murders were put into the prison. They were treated with capital punishment. and this has led across centuries to a diminishing gene pool favoring murder, favoring crime. Or another theory by Gregory Clark, famous theory developed by Gregory Clark. He said that there was a positive selection of burgher traits in Britain from the medieval times on until the 19th century regarding conscientiousness, predictability of behavior of persons, of discipline, self-discipline, of peaceableness, self-control, of delay of gratification, and industriousness. People showing such traits were more successful in society, have had more children, and this has led across century to an increasing gene pool relevant for such traits. Another theory was developed by Hajnal, Hungarian Jewish sociologist. He said, or he described, a positive selection of delay of gratification, self-control, conscientiousness, frugality, industry, and cognitive ability. He indirectly described this. His major idea was that there's a Western European marriage pattern, that people with these attributes shown here, from delay of gratification to industry and cognitive ability, have had higher chances to marry, to have an own family, and to have children. And people not showing such traits married later, or never married and never had a family and never had children. And this is now, in my interpretation, or from other researchers, this has led across centuries to a larger gene pool relevant for self-control, conscientiousness, frugality, and so on. Finally, there is a convincing body of research showing that consanguinity has a negative effect on democracy. Consanguinity means that relatives marry each other. For example, an uncle marries his niece, or a cousin marries his or her cousin. And the result is that spouses are genetically more similar than other spouses, and that the people within the family are to each other more genetically similar relative to people outside the family. Genetic similarity is concentrated within families with some political consequences. And the more marriages are in a society among relatives, the lower is the level of democracy in a society. Democracy is measured by an external expert rating, or, for example, by the percentage of votes for the losing parties, for the second row winners, for example, for the people who haven't had success in an election. And the larger the share of the losers, the stronger is the democracy. The others have a chance to gain votes. Other research also shows there's a negative effect between consanguinity and honesty in elections, or a positive effect between consanguinity and electoral fraud in Britain. What is interesting and important and exceptional for all these theories is that they are all related to culture. Culture has an effect, or is postulated, is assumed, culture has an effect on evolution, and this evolution changes attitudes and behavior across decades, across centuries. Or culture has an effect on genetic similarity, consanguinity. Consanguinity is not itself genetically determined by the theory, but consanguinity is determined by cultural factors, and these cultural factors lead to a change in genetic similarity, and they have an effect on political attitudes and behavior. Our approach to study human rights is to compare countries. We want to understand, to look for the causes why today countries differ in human rights. And according to our research question, following our research question, we need to use country-level data. We use country-level data from the later 20th century and from the first decades from 21st century. We apply a statistical analysis. We calculate correlations. Correlations are statistical measures describing the relationship between variables, how close are two variables, and in what direction is the relationship. Correlations vary between 1, 0, and -1, and a positive correlation means that when in one variable there's a larger value, we have also a larger value in the other way, in other variable. For example, height and weight are positively correlated. The taller people and the heavier are the people on average. We also use path analysis. Path analysis show the impact from one variable via another variable on a third variable. For example, A has an effect via B, and yes, A has an effect via B on C. A has an effect on B, B has an effect on C. There's an indirect effect. For example, sex has an effect on height, and height has an effect on weight. And because men are taller than women, they are on average heavier. Sex has an effect on height, and height has an effect on weight. And path analysis compare also the effect of two variables on a third variable. For example, age and sex has an effect on weight. Older people are on average heavier than younger people, and sex, men are on average taller than women, and because of this they are heavier. And this can be extend. Sex and age has an youth an effect on height, and height has an effect on weight, and so on. To understand this, to such complex relationships, we use figures. We show the effect with arrows and with numbers on these effects. You will see this later, and this is, I think, understandable for a broader audience. And we also apply longitudinal models. We show that variables can have an effect on each other. So height can have an effect on weight, and weight in use can have an effect on growth, on height at the end. Better nutritioned people in youth are at the end a little bit taller than less well-nourished people in youth. Of course, in adulthood, weight or nutrition has no effect anymore on height, only on weight. So the idea of longitudinal models is to analyze the effects from A to B and the effect from B to A across time. For statistical analysis, we need data, and our data come from these sources here. Human rights come from the Syria Human Rights Project. They have developed 4 indicators: a physical integrity rights index, an index for freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and women's rights. And we have calculated a grant average indicators, a grant mean. We use for education the variable educational level of society. This means, or this stands for, how long on average 25-year-old adults have attended school. How many years? Then we use the average cognitive ability level of a society, the mean of a society, based on student assessment studies like PISA, TIMSS, PIRLS, and so on, and on measures of intelligence, both together standing for cognitive ability. There are much more data from student assessment studies than from intelligence studies. But for more countries, especially for the developing countries, there are measures from intelligence tests. They both correlate very highly. Then we have measures for rule of law, political freedom, democracy, wealth standing for income, GDP per capita, income and production. Then we have measures, percentages for religion. How large is the percentage of disciples of Christianity, for example, of Islam, of Judaism, of Confucianism, Hinduism, and so on. This variable is a difficult to measure variable because many religions do not have official registers. So there are more or less estimates for the percentage of believers in one religion. Then we have indicators for evolution and measures or indicators for consanguinity. In detail, you can find this information in the original paper from me and Noah Carl, or in the book published by Cambridge University Press. Cognitive Capitalism, and this book is about the well-being of nations depending on cognitive capital and other variables. I will present now the results of statistical analysis, beginning with simple correlations. All correlations that I show are Pearson correlation, the usual correlation between two variables. Let's begin with the cognitive ability theory, with the cognitive paradigm. The assumption was that cognitive ability thinking leads to more moral behavior, and this will lead at the end, at the level of countries, to more human rights. And let's look at this table. There are correlations between education, measures of education, measures of cognitive ability, with human rights. And the correlations were calculated for different sizes of samples for a same 95 country sample in parentheses and for all countries for which we have data. Let's look first on the on the second and the third line with the variables education level of society and cognitive ability. We see a positive correlation between education and human rights and between cognitive ability and human rights. The correlation is 0.38 for education and 0.26 for cognitive ability. Education is assumed to increase cognitive ability. Going longer to school leads to higher intelligence and more knowledge. What is aber rather interesting is that education shows a slightly higher correlation with human rights than cognitive ability. The higher the education level in a society, the more are human rights respected. Now let's go to the results in parentheses and results for a 95 country sample. In all variables, we have the same set of countries. And there again, we see a higher correlation for education than with cognitive ability, 0.54 versus 0.51, a slightly higher correlation. And now let's look only to student assessment studies. In SAS means student assessment study or student achievement study. And we have here three measures: the mean, the cognitive ability level at 95%, standing for the cognitive ability level of an intellectual class. And we have the ability level at 5%, the level of people with low cognitive ability within a society. And this varies between countries, these levels. And we see here a slightly higher correlation with the 95% level than with the mean, 52 versus 50. And both the mean and the intellectual class level are slightly higher correlated than human rights with the cognitive ability level of the lower cognitive classes. Here correlation is only 0.48. This seems to indicate that the cognitive ability level of the intellectual classes vary, influencing the development of institutions, development of laws, development of political system, and working in everyday life in courts and police and so on, have a strong effect on human rights than the average ability level within a society. But the difference is not large. So let's sum up. We have a support. We find support for the cognitive ability thesis. Cognitive ability and human rights across countries are positively correlated. We always deal here with data on the level of countries. Second, education, or here the first point, education is slightly more correlated. And this could indicate that not only cognitive ability is important, but also attitudes which are formed by education. Education increases cognitive ability, intelligence, knowledge, but also can change attitudes in a positive way, being relevant for human rights. And it seems to be here, and this is not the normal results at the level of societies. Usually we have a higher correlation for cognitive ability than for education. So, and the last main result is the intellectual class is a little bit more important, and we assume that this is an institutional effect. So let's come to the second theoretical paradigm. Culture has an effect on human rights. And we have correlated here the share of believers in one religion with the average level of human rights in our society. And we see high positive correlations with Christianity. The more people in our country who believe in Christian religion, the higher is the human rights level. Let's have a look closer to the different streams of Christianity. Catholicism is positively correlated with human rights. Protestantism is higher correlated with human rights than Catholicism, but the share of people who are believers in Orthodox Christianity is not positively correlated with human rights. So only certain streams of Christianity are positively correlated with human rights. And this can support the assumption that within religion, not only the initial message is important, not only the founder is important, this is also the same for the three streams of Christianity, but also the later interpretation by major theologians and by major religious intellectuals and the lived practice. Islam is negatively correlated with human rights. The more people in a society who believe in Islam, the lower on average is the level of human rights. And this is even more underscored by a Christ-Muslim contrast. This is calculated by a subtraction. The more disciples of Christianity and the fewer disciples of Muslim religion, the higher is the human rights level in our country. Here in the second column of numerical results of correlations, we have chosen one indicator from the Human Rights Project, the freedom of religion. And there's one interesting result where while animism is not positively correlated with human rights, the freedom of religion is positively correlated with animism. And it seems to be that the liberal animism conviction leads more to freedom in religion than, for example, here Islam or Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and also Judaism. Let's sum up. Human rights seems to be a Christian Protestant phenomenon. Not only Protestant, but Protestantism shows a higher correlation than Catholicism, and both together have a positive correlation, not Orthodox religion. Islam and human rights are negatively associated, and other religions are more or less neutral. Animism shows a positive effect or positive correlation with religious freedom. Let's have a look on means, not on correlation, means. Major Christian countries or countries with a major Christian share, they show on average on a scale from 0 to 9, on average they show a human rights level of 6.8. And countries with a Muslim majority show an average on a scale from 0 to 9, a mean human rights level of 2.79. And this difference in effect sizes represents a difference of 1.5 standard deviation. This is a message for persons who know better statistics, but translated in everyday language, this means there's a huge gap in human rights between Christian and Muslim countries. Let's look at correlations in a subsample of third world countries. This is more or less an artificial category. We want to look rather in non-Western and non-rich countries. There's a positive correlation between culture and human rights, or between cognitive ability and human rights, or between evolution and human rights. And we see here in this subsample of third world countries, there's a positive correlation with the share of Christians. There's a negative correlation with the share of Muslims. Evolution, we will come later, which indicators we used, 0. And here, the last 4 correlations, we show partial correlations. Partial correlation means that we have a correlation between 2 variables, for example, share of Christians and human rights, and we're taking out of this correlation the effect, the possible influence of a third variable here, GDP or wealth. So the positive correlation between percentage of Christians and human rights, 0.56, is controlled for wealth. This means that the positive correlation with religion here does not depend on wealth. The same is true for the correlation with the negative correlation with the percentage of Muslims. Cognitive ability shows no positive correlation more, and evolution has also no correlation. Here in the third world country, we have also no positive correlation with cognitive ability. Based on this, it seems to be that the culture-religion theory, the culture-religion paradigm, is more supported by empirical evidence than the cognitive paradigm. Now let's look at the institutional hypothesis. The institutional hypothesis assumes that democracy, freedom of law, rule of law, and so on have a positive impact on human rights. And looking at these correlations, we see here very high relationships, very close relationships between human rights and political conditions. The higher the level of rule of law, of freedom, of democracy in a country, the higher is the level of human rights. The correlations are 0.65, 0.84, 0.70, and these correlations are even higher, they're much more higher than with cognitive ability. And these correlations with political institutions are also higher than with GDP per capita. That means that the relationship between political institutions and human rights is narrower, closer, more important than the correlation with wealth. It seems to be that this correlation does not depend on wealth. So, but the question remains, the open question, whether the institutions again do not depend on culture or cognitive ability. And maybe there's only a conceptual overlap, that what we measure with democracy, political freedom, and rule of law is more or less the same that we measure with human rights. So there's no effect of institution on human rights, or of human rights on institutions. Maybe there's a reciprocal effect, but both are standing for a common construct, measure of political modernization. To sum up, human rights measures are more strongly correlated with political conditions than with wealth, with GDP per capita, which supports the institutional paradigm. Freedom seems to be most important. I would not give this pattern a huge weight, but it's somewhat interesting, and it remains open to analyze what influences what. Politics has an effect on human rights has an effect on politics, or are both more or less the same. Let's come to the last table with correlations. We have measures of evolution and we have a measure of consanguinity. The measure of evolution is based on skin brightness and on cranial capacity. Both we use here of measures of evolution and not of causal factors. Skin brightness cannot have an effect on human rights itself, and cranial capacity can also not have directly an effect on human rights. Cranial capacity, brain volume can have an effect on cognitive ability, but for example, skin brightness cannot have an effect. We use them here as indicators of differences on evolution or of differences in ancestry. And we see here some minor correlations, not so high correlations with human rights. The evolution ancestry G factor based on skin brightness and cranial capacity shows a positive correlation of 0.23. Consanguinity, how large is the percentage of marriages in a society among relatives? An uncle marries his niece, cousins marriage themselves among each other, and we have here also a large negative correlation. Let's sum up the results for evolution and consanguinity. There are small positive correlations with human rights. If there's any effect, the indicators can stand only for an indirect effect. We need a theoretical explanation how they may work, and up to now we have not presented this theoretical explanation. And there's a large negative correlation between consanguinity and human rights. Consanguinity seems to be at odds against, or is not possible to combine with universality of rights and with equality in rights. Let's come to path analysis. In path analysis, we compare the effects of different factors on a criterion, and we can analyze direct and indirect effects. This can be shown here by the first figure. We have on the top left corner culture, here Christians, as one factor. The second factor is cognitive ability, and the third, not factor, but better to say variable. The third variable is human rights. On the arrows, we have always two numbers. The first number is the path coefficient or the regression coefficient. The values of path coefficients usually vary between -1, 0, and +1. And in parentheses, we have bivariate correlations. They always vary between -1, 0, and +1. The effects, the path coefficients, are standardized effects. So the size of effects between different variables can be compared. The last number we see on the right here, 0.61, is the share of the unexplained variance. 60%. So this model explains 30%, exactly 39% of country differences in human rights by the two variables, Christians and cognitive ability. 61% are not explained. This model does not have many variables, for example, not institutions, not historical processes, not GDP, not other religions. So it is not astonishing that around 60% of the variance is not explained. So let's look at the path coefficients. The share of Christians in a society has a positive impact on human rights. The size of the effect is large, 0.59. There's a huge positive impact on human rights in a society by the share of Christians. The more Christians in a country, in a society, the higher the level of human rights. There is additional and indirect effect of Christians via cognitive ability on human rights. The effect here between Christians and cognitive ability is positive. The effect is 28. The higher the percentage of Christians in a society, the higher is on average the cognitive ability level, but the effect is not large. It's a positive effect, but no large effect. And cognitive ability has a positive impact on human rights with 0.10. This is a small effect, not a large effect. So both culture and cognitive ability have a positive impact on human rights. Both paradigms are supported by this path analysis, but the effect of culture is much larger than the effect of cognitive ability for statistically explaining cross-country differences in human rights. Finally, we have here a direct effect and an indirect effect, and we can calculate the total effect. The total effect of culture on human rights is 0.59 plus 0.28 multiplied with 0.10. 0.28 multiplied with 0.10 is around 0.03. Indirect effect we can add. We can add 0.28 multiplied with 0.10. This is 0.3, and here we have an effect of 0.59, and this together added is a total effect of 0.62. We can also explain or calculate the variance explained. We have to multiply both terms. We have to multiply both terms and then add together, and the result has to be 0.39. And this multiplied is around 0.35, and this multiplied around is 0.03, and both added is around 0.38. And here we have not explained variance is 0.61, and both together have to sum up to 1. So the model is correct. There's no error in these numbers, maybe a small rounding error, and my calculation was also only done not with a calculator, but a simple rough calculation in my head. This is now a more complex model. You have again on the top left Christians, on the bottom right human rights. You have in the center cognitive ability. This is identical with the first model, but we added the education level of society. We have added the intellectual class level. We have added the average income per capita taken log. Why we have used the logarithm of wealth? Because we assume that increases at lower level of wealth have a more positive impact on the quality of life than increases on the top. If your wealth increases by $10,000, let's say from $60,000 per year to $70,000 per year, this means that you can travel to the Bahamas or buy the newest iPhone. But if your wealth increases from $5,000 from 5,000 to 15,000. This means that you can send your children to school, that they do not need to work, that you can buy medicine and so on. And this is much more important for the well-being, for the quality of life. Because of this, we have taken here the logarithm of wealth. So finally, we have democracy. Democracy is measured by experts' rating and by the share of the parties or the candidates who have not won an election. The larger the opposition, the larger the share of the opposition, the higher is the level of democracy, according to one concept of democracy. The other is quality of institutions and so on. Quality of democratic institutions. So let's come to the results. The share of Christians has again a positive impact on human rights, 0.31. The share of Christians has also a positive impact on democracy, and democracy has a huge positive impact on human rights. But we do not know whether this is a real impact of democracy on human rights, or there's a construct overlap, meaning that what is measured by democracy is also measured by human rights. But it's very plausible to assume that there's a positive impact of democracy on human rights. It's probably a little bit smaller or smaller than the numerical result here indicates. Wealth has only a small minor effect on human rights. Now let's look here in the center of the model. Christians, the share of Christians has a positive impact on education level of society. If a country is culturally dominated by Christian tradition, the average level of education is higher. Education has a small positive impact on democracy. It's a little bit astonishing, so small. Education has a positive impact on wealth. The intellectual class level has a positive impact on wealth, both standing for the cognitive human capital theory, that cognitive ability increases productivity, and productivity has a positive impact on wealth. Maybe there is a further positive effect of education going via personality, for example, via conscientiousness on productivity and income, wealth, and so on. We have two variables for cognitive ability. We have the average cognitive ability level of a society, and we have the intellectual class level ability of a society. How high is the cognitive ability level at the 95th percentile, standing for the ability level of an intellectual class or of a cognitive elite? And it seems to be that the cognitive ability level of an elite is more important for wealth, for example, via innovation, via inventing patents, and so on. Let's sum up. Again, culture and cognitive ability, but cognitive ability only indirectly have a positive impact on human rights. Institutions show a positive impact on human rights, but behind institutions is culture. Culture has a direct effect on human rights, and culture has an indirect effect via democracy, and indirect effect via education and cognitive ability on human rights. The cultural region paradigm is again more important for explaining cross-country differences in human rights than the cognitive moral enlightenment theory. But the cognitive moral enlightenment theory is not wrong, but shows smaller effects. The same model as before. Before we had for culture the share of Christians in a society. Here we have the share of Muslims in a society, and the result is more or less the same. There's a
impact of culture on human rights. There's an impact of cognitive ability indirectly on human rights. There's a huge effect of institutions, democracy on human rights. But here, Muslims have a negative effect on democracy. The higher the share of Muslims in a society, the lower is on average the level of democracy in a society. The lower is the level of education, and the lower is the level of human rights. Here we have a model as with the final criterion, not human rights, but a component of human rights, women's rights. Here on the bottom right, women's rights. Christians, we have as a starting value standing for culture, and we have also a further variable. This is consanguinity, standing for marriages between cousins or between uncles and nieces. The percentage of marriages between uncles and nieces, or more generally between relatives. The higher the share of Christians, the higher is the level of human rights. The higher the level of democracy, the higher is the level of women's rights. But the effect is smaller than the effect of democracy on human rights. The higher the share of Christians, the higher is the level of democracy, the higher is the level of education, and so on. This is not changed here at the center. Interesting is now the effect of consanguinity. Consanguinity has a negative effect on cognitive ability. At the individual level, there are several studies showing a negative impact of consanguinity on cognitive ability. There is also a higher rate of mental retardation and of other physical problems caused by genetic similarity of the parents. But consanguinity has also a negative impact on human rights. And here, again, the share of Christians has a negative impact on consanguinity. There's a long tradition of the Catholic Church condemning marriages between relatives, and many historical studies and several books describing the effect of the Catholic Church on reducing marriages among relatives. Let's sum up. Women's rights mainly depend on cultural religion. Institutions have an effect. Having no consanguineous marriages has a positive effect, or marriages among relatives has a negative effect. Education and cognitive ability have smaller positive effects. So let's come to the final path model. We have here now longitudinal data. We have measured twice human rights in the beginning of the 1980s and around 2010. To the beginning of the 80s and around 2010. And we have two times measured cognitive ability around the 90s and around 2010. For cognitive ability, we used here only student assessment studies. We have here more precise data for decades than when we would use intelligence tests. This is a longitudinal analysis, and we can here analyze reciprocal effects. That means we can analyze whether the effect of A on B is larger than the effect of B on A across time. A is here human rights, and B cognitive ability. There's an effect of human rights on cognitive ability with 0.06, and there's an effect of cognitive ability on human rights with 0.27. So the effect of cognitive ability on human rights is larger than the other effect, other way around of human rights on cognitive ability. This positive effect stands for the cognitive moral paradigm, cognitive moral enlightenment theory. Cognitive ability has a positive impact on human rights. But again, culture has a positive effect on human rights, and the effect is slightly larger or is larger than the effect of cognitive ability on human rights. 0.36 is larger than the effect of 0.27. Human rights itself has a positive effect on human rights. Countries with some decades before higher level of human rights have again a higher level of human rights. And cognitive ability has also a positive effect on later cognitive ability of 86. Countries in the past with higher level of cognitive ability have also in the future a higher level of cognitive ability. I would not understand this as a causal effect, but as the stability of cross-country differences. Finally, the share of Christians has a positive impact on cognitive ability via stressing, for example, education or stressing the relevance of women or the relevance of education for women. So also when we analyze the effect across time, when we analyze development across 30 years, the cultural rhythm theory seems to be more supported than the cognitive ability theory as a causal effect on human rights. Both show positive effects, but the effect of cultural religion theory is larger. I mentioned here the term causal. Longitudinal analysis allow better to speak about causal effects, but the interpretation of a statistical effect as a causal effect depends on whether we have not forgotten other important determinants of cross-country differences in human rights. And as I have shown in the past models, wealth seems not to be important, but institutions seem to be important. And when we would add here institutions, the direct effects or the effects of Christians and cognitive ability would be smaller, but they still, I assume, would have a positive impact via influencing the development of institutions. Let's sum up. We wanted to compare two competing theories. The cognitive moral enlightenment theory, going back to Socrates, Piaget, Kohlberg, Habermas, Özdilkov, versus the cultural rhythm theory, going back to Weber, Sombart, Harrison, and both theories assume that they can explain the historical development of human rights and that they can explain cross-country differences in human rights. But originally, their theories, the first theory is originally more based on comparison of individuals or on understanding individual moral behavior. The second theory is more sociological historical theories. We have applied both at the cross-country level. We have found for both theories empirical support. Both variables, cognitive ability as well as culture, show positive effects, but culture, religion
is clearly more important for us understanding cross-country differences in human rights than culture, than cognitive ability. Culture is more important than cognitive ability. I want to bring here two quotes. I will try to make it smaller. Now, okay. Two quotes stressing the impact, the huge impact of culture. We have shown in our models that not only culture and cognitive ability show some positive impacts, but also institution has shown a huge impact. But we assume that culture is more important than institutions because culture influences also institutions, and because we think that what is measured by our institutional variables is also covered by human rights. There's an overlap of concepts and overlap of variables. But to be clear, I do not assume that institutions have no effect. I only think that the effect is smaller than shown by the statistical coefficients, by the pure correlations or regression coefficients. So now let's come to the two quotes. The first is from Alexis de Tocqueville, a French political scientist. He visited in the 19th century America and has written a famous book, Democracy in America. And now let's hear him. Too much importance is attributed to laws, too little to mores. I'm persuaded that the most fortunate situation and the best laws cannot maintain a constitution in spite of mores, while the latter still turn to good account the most unfavorable positions and the worst laws. People with beneficial mores can live in a good society in spite of bad institutions, because mores are more important than institutions, and mores, we assume, depend on culture. On gender equality as dependent variable, this quote is from two economists. Political institutions do not significantly influence education of girls. The primary influence on gender inequality in education is through culture and religion. Discrimination against girls is especially pronounced in Muslim dominated countries. Again, culture is more important than political institutions, and this is here especially relevant for the education of girls. Culture has an impact on institution, and culture has an impact on education, and education influences the development and functioning of institutions, and in the long run, via other variables, has also an impact on human rights. We have not spoken about wealth and evolution. Wealth shows a minor positive impact on human rights in some of our models, and evolution has shown
also correlations with human rights, but the correlations were smaller, and there is no theory in which way, or we have not presented a theory in which way evolution can have a positive impact on human rights. Respectively, the theories shown at the beginning were not or we have not used further empirical indicator measures standing for evolution. For example, the harsh Roman and medieval punishments for criminals, or for the European marriage pattern, or for a special positive selection of how I would call it burgher values in England, having effect on development of our personality, being positive for human rights. We want to deal now with open questions and possible counter arguments against the impact of culture and cognitive ability on human rights. First, isn't it personality attributes of individuals and aggregated at the level of society are relevant for understanding country differences in human rights? Are norms important, or is personality important? What aspect of personality can be important? For example, are prudent behavior control or low impulsiveness? One example or one important area would be crime. Crime has to do something with high impulsiveness and with no prudent behavior control. Authors working in this direction, but reinterpreted here by me, were John Hatchnall, Gary Clark, or Peter Frost, all assuming an impact of culture, of society on personality, and for John Hatchnall, in my view, also on the evolution of personality across centuries. Altogether stand for a historical development of a well-controlled, conscientious, prudent burgher personality. Yes, I think personality could be important, but is this, for example, important for the equal treatment of sexes? I think this has less to do with personality, but more with norms, more with ideology, Weltanschauung, and religion. Or the respectful treatment of others, for example, that the Spanish king has published laws to protect the Indians in South America. This has nearly nothing to do with personality, but more with norms, with convictions based on religion. Or guilt. The feeling of guilt is very important to self-control, for reflecting about one's own behavior, changing, reflecting about own past behavior with an effect on future
own behavior. But guilt again is important aspect, is an important aspect of Christianity, and here are we again in culture. I think personality is not wrong for explaining cross-country differences or also historical differences in human rights, but it is less important than norms, than religion and culture. My estimate would be it's 80% norms and 20% personality among the culture effect. So the culture effect contains about 20% personality, but it's only a guess. It is not based on statistical data. Another counter argument is that what we see here, I hope that this will be, well, there are some lines here in the graph. In the original presentation, there are no lines. Here you see the facade of Santa Maria Novella in Florence. This facade was constructed by Leon Battista Alberti. This is an Italian architect, but also philosopher and exemplary person standing for a burgher culture. He published also a book about how to conduct one's life, and this is a good example for the burgher world, of a burgher ideology, being patient, for example, well educated, thinking about the consequences of one's behavior, and so on. So maybe what we here see in international differences in human rights are not effects of culture, but are effects of differences in development of a burger world. It's not religion, but it's a civil class of well-educated and autonomous people within society, middle classes, civil society, bourgeoisie, or burger people. And these people have developed institutions, have developed a certain worldview, roughly independent from religion and culture. Especially important for this burger world was the impact of city culture, cities in northern Italy and in Germany or in Belgium. Stadtluft macht frei, urban air makes you free, and when you are living in political and economic freedom, you develop certain personality traits being positive for human rights. My answer to this objection is, I think this is not wrong what is here described, but the impact of religion in third world countries, what we have shown on human rights, or the impact in Africa underscores the effect of culture. The burger world could be a further effect, a further variable, but culture is still important. And the effect of or the impact of a city culture in Italy and Germany or Central Europe, yes, this could be a positive condition for development of the burger world. But in France, for example, or in Great Britain, there were less independent cities, and they are also good examples for development of human rights, especially for human rights. There are good examples here, Britain, and for a burger world, for the bourgeoisie. Another objection is that the development of human rights is crucially important on individualism. And when we compare internationally the degree of individualism in societies, then we see that individualism is especially pronounced in Western countries in Western, North, Central Europe, in North America, Australia, and New Zealand, and less, for example, in Africa, less in Muslim countries, and also less in East Asian countries. There's an old tradition of individualism in Europe. There's a culture of comrades among or within an aristocratic elite. There was egalitarian relationship between these people within this group. There are a lot of papers and a book about this historical development by MacDonald. Within this aristocratic elite, within this noble group, there were reciprocity, equality, the principle of merit. The stronger, the better, the more achieving persons received more respect. There were free choice and openness. This is all not to see as absolute, but compared to other cultures who are much more collectivist. And within the European elite, there was usually a mosaic structure of power. There was not one single king ruler who dominated all, but there were different people who have had power. And the best example of this is the German history in the Middle Age, of course, and there are other examples, French absolutism, or Germany, the rule of Hitler, but these are all exceptions. Usually a king, the ruler in Europe, has had no absolute power. Answer: yes. The reference to individualism, the higher degree of individualism in Europe, and this could lead to, or this could have supported the development of human rights. This is an important objection, similar as burgher world, or is older individualism maybe a force which has transformed religion into the effective force for human rights. What I want to say with this, that, for example, the person Martin Luther or Protestantism, who are crucial for the development of human rights, not only are Christians, but also are influenced by the culture of individualism in this part of the world, and are also influenced by a burgher culture, by other persons around them being successful individual members of a civil class. And that altogether was then influential to develop human rights and, in general, also modernization. And supporting this interpretation is that Western Christianity shows a positive impact on human rights in statistical analysis, but not Orthodox Christianity. Also see the historical development of human rights as a power struggle, a fight for power of the nobles against the king, or of the less powerful in the second row against the most powerful in the first row. And religion could be only an instrument of other forces to gain more power against the king or the ruler, and so on. Yes, but I think the original message and example of the founders continue to differ between religions. So the Bible and Jesus, for example, or the New Testament are show more positive impacts for human rights than other religious leaders or other religious books are more relevant in a positive way from our perspective today on human rights. Within the third world, Christianity still shows a positive impact. And within the sub-Saharan country sample, Christianity again shows a positive impact. So when we are looking at other regions of the world where individualism less plays a role, culture still has an impact. Couldn't it be a mere chance product that human rights are associated with Europe, are associated with Christianity? There was a small random event in history in Europe, and this small random event has started a historical development to more human rights, and this development has nothing to do with culture, Christianity, religion, and so on. Maybe there's a kind of butterfly effect in the early in the late Roman time or early medieval time, ending in high level of human rights today. For example, there's a fragmentation of power since the end of the Roman Empire in Europe, and this has led to more independence of individuals, cities, religious institutions, and this has supported the development of individual rights, and this, in the long run, has generalized to human rights in an inherent, logical, coherent development. Here on the right side, I show with a photo a very improbable random event. I was putting down my papers on the ground in my office, and I threw them, and the sheets ended, the papers ended like this, and this is the standing on their side, or not laying down like in 99% of cases. And this is a very improbable random event, and such an improbable random event could have started a long-term development here to human rights. Yes, this is one possible argument, but where are the convincing empirical data to support this theory of a path effect starting with a small initial random event? And still we see positive impact or impact of culture on human rights, for example, in third world countries or in Africa and so on. Culture seems to be still important for development of human rights. So our approach was a statistical one, comparing a large set of countries. An alternative methodological approach would be to study single countries or pairs of countries and compare their development. Also, what we have not done is a historical hermeneutic analysis of the idea of the development of concepts, Weltanschauung, ideologies, or the concept of human rights. These are other approaches, and these analyses can be done by other researchers. What I recommend for case studies or for pairs of case studies, countries, for example, we can compare Canada versus Mexico, the development of Canada versus Mexico in human rights, Estonia versus Ukraine, India versus Pakistan, Sri Lanka versus Bangladesh, Greece versus Turkey, Armenia versus Azerbaijan, Georgia versus Turkmenistan, Finland versus Israel, or Israel versus Egypt. We have here always pairs of countries who are more similar in certain regards than other pairs of countries. Canada and Mexico, for example, are former colonies in America. Estonia and Ukraine are in Eastern Europe and formerly ruled by the Soviet Union or by communist regimes. India, Pakistan, or in South Asia. But in every single pair here, we have also a cultural difference, Protestantism versus Catholicism, or Protestantism versus Orthodox Christianity, or Hinduism versus Islam, or Buddhism versus Islam, and so on. The last two pairs, Iran and Afghanistan, and Costa Rica and Colombia, they stand for similar culture. Here, Iran, Afghanistan, Muslim culture, or Costa Rica, Colombia, Catholic, but with considerable differences in human rights, and such pairs can be used to analyze an impact independent of culture. Finally, are there necessary limits of a human rights approach? This has now nothing to do with research, but with the practice of human rights. An unlimited human rights approach leading to open borders in countries may, in the long run, destroy an open human rights-oriented society. I think you know the paradox of tolerance. If people, single persons, or if societies are too tolerant, persons will abuse this tolerance, and tolerance will be ended. So it is necessary for the tolerant to be intolerant against the intolerant. And the same problem was mentioned by the German historian Sieferle for human rights and for immigration. It seems to be that we are facing an aporia, a problem with a contradiction in itself, or with a phenomenon with an inner contradiction. A concrete example in everyday life, for example, here in Germany, a human rights-oriented policy leads to fewer human rights for Jews, for women, for homosexuals, and transgender people. All these people had been attacked in demonstrations or everyday life, in the night in streets, and so on, their houses, their religious buildings, by people who were given the opportunity to immigrate due to a human rights approach in the German government. In the long run, we have here human rights for the immigrants, but a reduced human rights level for important groups within Germany. At the end, let us come back to the question raised at the beginning. Why are there problems with publishing and reception? Especially, why is there such a low reception rate of the human rights paper? I think human rights is a very important subject, is a fundamental condition of human well-being, and any research on describing and explaining differences between countries in human rights is politically and scientifically important. First, about problems in publishing. In general, it is difficult to publish something. The rejection rates, depending on the journal, are between 30 and 95%. That means that about 9 of 10, or 95 of 100 papers submitted to journals, to certain journals, are rejected. So being rejected as an author is not so special. However, again, this is an important subject, and we have published, we were the first who published a study on explaining cross-country differences by using a statistical approach. I think the important answer on the question is that we are facing here a tension between an orientation towards human rights and an orientation towards scientific values. If we follow human rights in a broad meaning, this means that we as Europeans or people of the Western world or scientists do not criticize others, other peoples, other countries, other cultures. We should not present ourselves or our own group, our own culture as better than others. This is at odds with the human rights approach to claim that certain aspects of a culture, especially of our culture, is better, and what the research is showing that are at a higher level in Western countries, and this seems to be caused in cultural conditions and somewhat in cognitive conditions, which are in a certain way expressed in Western countries, leading to a higher level of human rights, or even in looking back, using our historical perspective, leading to the development of human rights in the last 1,000 years. The assumption is in broad meaning of human rights that all people are equal, all nations and cultures are equal. They do not have only the same rights. All people should not only be treated equally, but they are empirically also equal. They are all equal and equally good. And also, we should be a nice guy. We should not say something negative about other people. However, science should follow another approach. Science should try to describe the reality in a truthful way. Science should try to approach as best as science can the truth. And this is here in a conflict with the normative background of human rights. But we cannot be both we cannot be good scientists and always be nice guys. We cannot describe only positive things without having a look also on negative aspects. The world, as we have seen in the study of human rights, does not only exist of countries where the human rights are well respected. So we have a tension between political orientation, between a human rights orientation, between a progressive political orientation and a scientific endeavor. How this tension can be resolved? We can apply also here the paradigm of cognitive dissonance. We have dissonance between norms and values, progressive norms and values, and norms of human rights, and the norms of science. How we can reduce this cognitive dissonance? First, we can discredit the message and its transmitter. I will quote here from the reviews we received from some journals, and that this paper would not stand up in terms of methodological rigor that our readers expect. And when we asked for more details, which problems here are in the method section or in our approach, we received no answer by the journals. Or simply, the tension can also be resolved by simply ignoring both the message and the transmitter. As a journal editor, you do not read or send out the manuscript for review. You read it only diagonally, and then you stop any further treatment of the paper, any further reading, and any further review. And of course, it should not be published. And as a scientist, when the paper is published, you don't read such works, and you certainly don't cite them.
So finally, let's sum up. In a religion or culture in which the individual life or the individual in general is valued more, human rights are more respected. Culture is much more important for understanding cross-country differences in human rights than cognitive ability or education or politics or wealth and so on. Politics, institutions are important, education is important, cognitive ability is also important, but culture is much more important, and behind these variables, behind these sociological, social circumstances is culture influencing directly and via institutions or via institutions, via education, via cognitive ability, the development, the historical development, the development of cross-country differences in human rights. Thank you very much for listening me, and I hope you will follow future presentations too. Thank you very much. Bye bye.